Welcome, friends, to yearly meeting, and a particularly warm welcome from the Quaker Socialist Society and to our 2018 Psalter lecture. My name is Mick Langford. I am the clerk to QSS, and we thought it appropriate perhaps for people who are not so familiar with QSS and the Psalters for me just to say one or two introductory words about them and about QSS, and then we will get into the lecture itself. And following the lecture, I have a few notices. QSS is not the first Quaker Socialist Society. The Socialist Quaker Society was founded in 1898 with the core aims to advance socialist principles amongst Quakers and to persuade Quakers of their unique position for the spread of socialism. Many Quakers were also active or in touch with the Fabian Society, which reprinted a work by John Woolman. It might also be suggested that the Quaker Socialists of their time reintroduced John Woolman to British friends. The SQS, the Socialist Quaker Society, continued in existence until 1928, at which point it might have felt that its job had been done. However, friends thought it necessary to introduce a further society in 1975, the Quaker Socialist Society, which has remained in existence since then. The Quaker Socialist Society is aiming to provide fellowship for Quakers committed to socialist ideas and to promote Quaker influence within the socialist movement. Our first pamphlet in 1977 refers to the foundations of a true social order as the starting point of our work. QSS is not limited to connections with any particular political party. In keeping with Quakers' spiritual understanding, we remain open to new light. We seek to discern new movements in the spirit and actuality of our age that speak to our concern for social and climate justice. Now, why the Psalter lecture? Alfred and Ada Psalter were Quakers at the turn of the 20th century and into the early decades of that century. They were initially members of the Independent Labour Party and subsequently the Labour Party. Alfred was an MP, and Ada was one of the first women councillors in London and the first woman mayor of a Labour borough, of a London borough. But this tells little of their story. Working out of Alfred's medical practice in Bermondsey, it is no exaggeration to say that they transformed their local borough, community and environment in which they lived. And they were of national influence too. Their stories are heroic, inspirational and poignant. For QSS today, we seek to learn from their application of ethical socialism in practice, rooted as it was in their non-conformist faith. I will now turn to Tim G, who will introduce our speaker for the 2018 Salter Lecture.
So, bringing us up to more recent times, last year we heard prepared ministry reflecting on Jesus' parable of binding the strong one, and that was reflected in our minute 38, where we said together, "The world is not divided into them and us. We all need to be bound, and we all need to be liberated and transformed. Working in partnership with others can lead us to question our own practices. For only when we are working on ourselves can we witness and speak beyond friends." So I'm very happy to introduce our Salter lecturer for this year, Diana Jeater, to share something of her process of questioning. A little bit about her. Diana has been working on Zimbabwean history since 1982, during which she says she's learnt as much or more about herself as about Zimbabwe's past. Her research is rooted in a commitment to equality and tries to expose how power relationships within and between communities have damaged the possibilities for deep human connections. She is an editor of the Journal of Southern African Studies and is Emeritus Professor of African Studies at UWE Bristol. She also spent 2 years as Senior Programme Manager at Woodbrook. Diana is currently based at the University of Liverpool and is working on a long-term project in tandem with the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission in Zimbabwe to provide deep histories of traditional grassroots reconciliation and community healing practices. Reflecting on this experience and on her Quaker faith, the theme of Diana's lecture is Britain, Africa, and Quakers, and will be explored through the question, bearing witness or bearing whiteness. Diana will speak for about 50 minutes, followed by some time for questions and reflections. As is customary at yearly meeting, we will start and finish in silence, upholding Diana, and Diana will speak when she's ready.
Thank you, friends. Before I start, I'd like to thank Tim and Mick and Graham Taylor for inviting me to present the Salter Lecture this year. And I'd also like to thank the many friends that I've spoken with in preparing what I have to say today. So I saw in some of the materials that were circulated to advertise this lecture that I'm an expert on Africa, which is quite a tall order. As you probably know, Africa is the world's largest continent. Not many people realize how very big it is. You can fit the whole of Europe, Russia, the US, China, and India into Africa's land space, and you will still have little bits of room left over. There are 54 nations in Africa and an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 languages. It includes Nigeria, which is the 5th wealthiest nation in the Commonwealth by GDP. And if we're talking about wealth, it also includes Angola, which not many people know, but Angola actually bailed out Portugal during the 2008 financial crash. And of course, it includes Zimbabwe, which is where I work on. Africa has an extraordinary diversity of habitats, including deserts, grasslands, rainforests, mountains, river basins, and at least 3 climate zones. So it really is a very big, very diverse part of the planet. Interesting then, when I tell people that I work on Africa, how often they say things like, I went on holiday to Africa once, or I'm involved in supporting a project in Africa. Now, of course, it's not Africans that say that to me. And on the whole, it's not people from the Caribbean or Latin America or Asia or Southeast Asia who say those sorts of things. It is overwhelmingly people from what we might call the white world. In Britain, you've probably already noticed that white people tend to regard Africa from the viewpoint of either consumers or donors, as a place where they go on holiday or as a place where they do good. And frequently, both of those things combined, which is something I'll come back to. There is a tendency to regard Africa as a single place, a place typified by poverty and wildlife and rather noisy dancing. And as an historian, I find all of that interesting. And when I say this is what white people do, obviously I'm including us, British Quakers, in that. Because, as we know, we are very white. Of course, most Quakers have black skins and live in Africa. But we don't think of Quakerism as an African faith. In fact, only yesterday there was a post on Facebook about the Cleveland, Ohio mission to Kenya in 1902 that founded Kenyan Quakerism, that now constitutes, I think, currently over half of all the Quakers in the world. That's over half of all the Quakers in the world. You think we might have noticed that, mightn't you? And yet, the comments on this Facebook post were, wow, that's interesting. Who knew? Friends, why don't we know? Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the Nigerian novelist, gave a now totally viral all over the internet TED talk about what she called the single story of Africa. How when we talk of Africa, we just tend to tell one story, as though it could possibly begin to represent such a huge and diverse place. And within British Quakers, the story that we tell ourselves about our relationships with Africa tends to be about what we do to help. It's a good story. Quaker African Interest Group is full of people who do really excellent work on the continent. This isn't true of all the people who go there to help. You may be aware of the critiques of development. Development is, after all, a massive international industry. And if people in Africa stopped being poor and needy, there wouldn't be an industry. So the industry itself has a vested interest in Africa being a story of poor people in need of help. I've actually published a blog piece on this, which again gets very widely circulated, called Parasites on the Poor. But most of the work done by people within the Quaker African Interest Group are not like that. This isn't the kind of work they do. They tend to do grassroots work with friends, with capital F's and small f's, at the grassroots level around things that are of direct interest to us as Quakers. I'm sure most of you are aware of the work of Turning the Tide in East Africa, for example. At the most recent Quaker African Interest Group meeting, we heard about the Green Olive Trust, which is an educational foundation that works in Kenya. There are long-term projects around peace and development in the Congo. There's our peace work in Sierra Leone. and very close to my own heart. There's a wonderful work, curated, if you like, overseen by Milton Keynes meeting, with Lekweni in Zimbabwe. But this work is still defined by us as the donors and the experts, and people in Africa as the recipients. So when we asked friends from Africa to deliver our Swarthmore lecture, we weren't surprised that they spoke about peace work and development and their problems with donor expectations. What we should have been surprised about, perhaps, was that we didn't ask them to speak about their spiritual lives. Sometimes, a lot of the time, being donors makes us feel good about ourselves. Not surprisingly, it's better than the alternatives, after all. Yes, we're doing good in the world, we're helping people. That's much better than being Donald Trump. But often it makes us feel uncomfortable, especially when we're there on the ground and people ask us for money. And that discomfort is partly because of our awareness of our colonial history. Do we owe these people? Partly, it's because we're aware of our privileges. And partly, it's just because the whole situation is so unfair, and we know that we're on the wrong side of that unfairness. I want to read to you, friends, a wonderful minute, well actually minutes 17 to 19, of the FWCC Central Executive Committee of March 2017, titled Issues of Privilege and Historical Injustice. We have taken up a concern raised by several friends for how FWCC's work in every part of the globe is affected by a history of colonialism and inequality, and by media distortions that influence perceptions of people in other parts of the world. Too often, friends in wealthier countries only see images of people elsewhere in situations of poverty, misery, and need, while friends in poorer countries see media images as if all people in wealthier countries were prosperous and successful. We too often hurt each other by assumptions we make, stories we tell, misunderstandings, favoritism, and superficial relationships. Even as we commit to forgiveness, it is difficult to forget or undo long-standing injustices and slights. We recognize that a key part of FWCC's work is to overcome these historical patterns and to foster and model authentic relationships of equality and mutuality. That requires a willingness to name destructive patterns as they occur, to recognize when we have made mistakes, and to ask for and offer genuine forgiveness. When we know each other more fully in our homes, families, and meetings, we can better understand the full person, not just the cosmetics or stereotypes. Much work has been done in this regard over the past decades, but more remains to be done. It's a beautiful minute. It expresses an important discomfort. And I want to talk more about that feeling of discomfort. Because, friends, as much as the desire to help, our feelings of discomfort about help also come from genuine leadings. Friends, what I've learned is that if we truly listen to the promptings of love and truth in our hearts, we begin to move away from thinking, how can I help? And we start on a different journey. Engaging with Africa takes us on a journey, not as Conrad proposed, into the heart of darkness, but into the heart of whiteness, which perhaps for Conrad was the same thing. In Jewish in Christian and Muslim cultures, we're told a story about self-awareness being the fruit, and because of the nature of what a fruit is, also the seed of the tree of knowledge. When they ate from the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve became self-aware. They became aware of their nakedness, and they were ashamed. We have become aware of our whiteness, and we have become, perhaps, a bit ashamed. But, like Adam and Eve, sometimes we want to hide from that shame. We want to share the burden of blame. We start to tell a story about how we misperceive each other. And that's where I begin to feel uncomfortable about that beautiful minute. Because it seems to me it misses the point about historical injustice. Historical injustice creates a particular kind of world. It doesn't stop when colonialism stops. We are born into a world that was made by historical injustice. It's the world we still live in. And just because we're good and kind and mean well, it doesn't mean we're excused from, or above, or apart from the systems of privilege that shape our world. So we may have misunderstandings, but where the responsibility for putting those right lies, I think, is not equally balanced between us and those whom we go to help. Our friends in poorer countries may like us. They may recognize that we're not rich by the obscene, distorted standards of our home country. We may recognize that they're perhaps more competent and less demanding than we had originally feared. But however good our relationships, however much we spend time in each other's homes, we still have more power in the relationship. And that, I think, is what we need to look at. That is the mutual misperception that we need to face. When I first started teaching in a university, I had a student who was writing a dissertation about the history of Southern Rhodesia/Rhodesia. I'm sure you're all aware of that history. Under Ian Smith, under UDI, there was white minority rule. There was systematic discrimination against Africans in all areas of life. The student described all of this very well and wrote very eloquently about the suffering that this entailed for Africans. But there was no explanation in it, and I kept pushing her to try to get her to analyze more. In her penultimate draft, somewhat intemperately, I wrote in the margins, yes, but why were they behaving towards Africans like this? They were not nasty people. They were perfectly kind to children and animals. When she submitted it, one of my colleagues, the co-marker, read it first, and he said, have a look at page 5. And there in the middle of page 5, there was a sentence, it's very odd how horrible they were to Africans, because they weren't nasty people. They were perfectly nice to children and animals. Friends, we need an analysis of power. And we need an analysis of what it means to disempower. Adam and Eve, we're told, felt shame in Eden, that heaven on earth. Well, as Quakers, we aim to build the kingdom of God, the heaven on earth, right here, because God has no hands but ours. There is no place for shame in the kingdom of God. Self-awareness must lead to change, not to shame. Traveling into the heart of whiteness is a journey, not a destination. It is what we know. It is what we know, in Fox's words, experimentally. Now, I've always found Advices and Queries 11 rather challenging. Of course, there's some I love. Number 1, of course, from which everything else follows. Number 27 and 28, which I think are most people's favourites. But number 11 is a hard one. Be honest with yourself. What unpalatable truths might you be evading? In the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie observed, what you believe depends on what you've seen. Not only what is visible, but what you are prepared to look in the face. So I want to talk a little about what I've learned to look in the face, and how I've tried to get others to see me and to look me in the face too. And in this, I'm guided by the second half of Advices and Queries 11, which gets a little bit more encouraging. It says, when you recognize your shortcomings, do not let that discourage you. In worship together, we can find the assurance of God's love and the strength to go on with renewed courage. So I want to tell you a little bit about my journey. The first time I ever set foot on the continent of Africa was in what we'd now call my gap year, although those hadn't been invented in those days. And I did the hippie trail with a bunch of friends. We went down to Morocco in a van. And I had a revelation while I was there, that the tourist attraction was that these people were poor. They didn't look like us and live like us because they were poorer than us. And at that point, I thought, I never want to do this again. If I'm going to go and see the world, I want to do it in a way where I'm part of changing things. But we've seen that tourism engagement is what most people think about. Well, not most people, but an awful lot of people in this country think about when they think about Africa. And when the FWCC Minute talks about media representations and misrepresentations and how they see us as rich, we see them as poor, the tourist industry has got a lot to do with that. Our poor don't go there. Their rich become assimilated with us. Structures of tourism mean that we often don't meet each other routinely in a like-for-like context. And that's true of aid work as well. Increasingly, there's something called ethical tourism, part of ethical consumption. In fact, there's even a phrase, a word, development tourism, all one word, development tourism. Some people might call it poverty tourism, but at least it's poverty tourism with a clean conscience. You're building a school, you're helping with some project. And actually, a lot of these projects do very good things. But there's a book that's just been published by João Alfonso Baptista, who is Mozambican, called The Good Holiday, Development Tourism and the Politics of Benevolence in Mozambique. And in it he says the problem with this stuff is that it locks us into a dependency relationship where we have to go on being worthy of benevolence. And we can't move forwards if that's how we run our economy. So I went to Morocco. I thought, I don't want to do this again. I don't want to be a poverty tourist. So I thought, I know, I'll go and get involved in development. I'll go and help. I'll go and do good things in Africa. So I started to work on a doctorate on women in Zimbabwe. People always said I was working on women. I pointed out that everybody else was working on men, but women seem to be a meaningful category in the way that men weren't. In any case, I was going to go and help women in Zimbabwe by writing a doctorate on them. I was heartened when I started hanging out with the development people and aid workers in Harare in their parties, there's a lot of parties, about how much they talked about the need to listen to rural women. But as I listened to them a bit more, I had another big revelation. They wanted to listen to rural women because they had agendas that they had already set elsewhere. And the problem is, for them, they needed women to buy into those agendas because otherwise they wouldn't meet their targets. The reason why they wanted to listen to rural women was in order more efficiently to impose ideas that had been formulated elsewhere in a language that would make them acceptable to local women. So I thought maybe I don't want to do development after all. Doesn't really seem to be about what I'm looking for. It seems to be another form of imperialism. So my doctorate became much more about sexuality and identity and how people express themselves and how the experience of white occupation changed the spaces in which women could move. And it was intended to provide a new discourse, a new way of thinking about African women as sexual agents in ways that moved aside from the moral discourses that had dominated them so far. So I got my PhD. By the time I got my PhD, I think I had lived a sum total of 15 months in Zimbabwe in the whole of my life. And guess what? I was a world expert on Zimbabwe. I was a world expert on Zimbabwe because I had a doctorate from the University of Oxford. I had colleagues in Zimbabwe who had lived in Zimbabwe all of their lives, who knew much more about Zimbabwe than I did. But nobody ever asked them to international conferences as world experts on Zimbabwe. And that was because they came from the University of Zimbabwe and their skins were not white and their voices were not respected. I sometimes do a thought experiment with my students. I say to them, imagine if all of British history, all the respected British history, all the stuff that you have to read about British history was written by Zimbabweans. So a few British people can write British history as well, but actually all of the really good archives about British history are in Zimbabwe. So you have to get funding to go there in order to be able to use them. And the way that Zimbabweans write about British history is in terms that make sense to Zimbabweans. So they're not really interested in our king lines, they're not particularly interested in our politicians, they're interested in big lineages and how lineages have changed across time and how marriage is negotiated. And it doesn't fit terribly well onto British history, but that's the history we all have to read because this is the people who make history. And my students look really surprised and they find it really hard to imagine what it would be like if all British history was written by Zimbabweans, all the history that's recognized as worthwhile history. But this is the everyday reality for my colleagues in Zimbabwe. All of the great authorities on Zimbabwean history, including me, are white. So I was beginning to think, you know, this is quite hard. This who I am and what my relationship is and what I can do to help. Every time I try to help, I just seem to be consolidating existing structures that are making things worse. Meanwhile, along the way, I had picked up a partner. He'd picked me up. Something happened anyway, who was Zimbabwean. Growing up black in Zimbabwe under Ian Smith and during a liberation war causes a lot of damage, a lot of trauma. Most days things were fine, but suddenly a switch would turn and I would find myself at the receiving end of a tirade about how racist I was. And if there was one thing I was pretty sure about myself, it was that I wasn't racist. So I was very puzzled and indeed hurt, deeply, deeply hurt by this accusation. But because I loved this man, I tried to hear what he was saying. And eventually, I began to understand what he meant when he accused me of being racist. It was because I had privileges that were denied to him that I hadn't even noticed. This I learned experimentally. So after I wrote my first book, I didn't know what to do, really. I didn't want to go on being the expert on Zimbabwean women. I thought maybe Zimbabwean women ought to be the expert on Zimbabwean women. So my next book, eventually I realized there was only one topic I could write about. And that was about white people who had gone to Zimbabwe and had become experts on Zimbabweans. I thought, that at least I can write about. So I began to study the very first experts on Africans in Zimbabwe, in southern Rhodesia, the people who codified the language and the law and customs and administered that language and that law and customs and begun to write the anthropology and the ethnography. And I began to realize how deep our misperceptions of Zimbabweans in the academy went. It went right back to the beginning. All our knowledge in the academy was compromised ab initio from the start because the white people went in there, mostly they meant well, but there was only one group that they could learn about Zimbabwean Africans from, and that was Zimbabwean Africans. So they spoke to them, but what they heard was distorted by what was already in their heads. We cannot escape the history behind the moment we live in. They heard things, but they made sense of them in ways that made sense to them, not to the Zimbabweans they were speaking with. And then they wrote them down. They codified the language according to forms of grammar that they were already familiar with. They codified the laws according to grammars of law and ways of thinking about justice that they were already familiar with. And then they began to teach each other these things. And at that point, they stopped talking to Africans because they had the knowledge. Within a generation, Africans going to school and being asked to write things in their own language were being told that they were not using their own language grammatically. So I painted myself into a corner in writing this book. I said, I can have no claim to expertise because my expertise is based in this academy where everything we know and every way in which we think is determined by a culture from elsewhere that has distorted the way that we look at Zimbabwean culture. I had, in effect, disempowered myself, which is what I wanted to do. The problem was that nobody noticed. I thought I'd thrown a massive challenge to the academy about how we disempower ourselves. And I got reviews saying, what a very interesting book. It was at this point that I went to work at Woodbrook. I'd kind of run out of the academic route, and I went to get some spiritual succor by working at Woodbrook instead. Because I had now reached the point where there was no maneuvering. These are structures of power. Every relationship we have as white people, with the history of the world at our backs, is compromised by that history. Not because it's the past, but because it has made our present. So when we want to do good, which is a true leading, some of you, I'm sure, will remember hearing Lee Taylor, who's here somewhere, I saw her a moment ago, speaking so powerfully at yearly meeting a couple of years ago about how she was led to go and work with Lequeni. That was a true leading. But unfortunately, our true leadings come to us in a world that is imperfect. And when we think of ourselves as saviors, when we think of ourselves as people who are going to do good, then we stop being seekers. And surely as Quakers, above all else, we are seekers. So we stop being seekers, and instead we begin to worry about how we appear. A worry that was superbly encapsulated at the Quaker African Interest Group earlier this year, but I think it was Bronwyn Harwood, she'll correct me if it wasn't her, that we are demanding, bureaucratic, inflexible, cautious, and remote. It's not a great self-image, really. But still we position ourselves as saviors who are going in to help, not least, it seems, because we most commonly encounter Africans in a situation where we are white and British and rich, and they are black and African and poor. And this is despite Nigeria being the 5th richest nation in the Commonwealth, despite Angola bailing out Portugal, despite there being at least one African amongst the world's 100 richest people. There's a reason why we don't see those bigger pictures. It's the world we live in that doesn't want us to see those bigger pictures. But we're also, I think, dazzled by our own aid projects. We know why aid is important. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you know the rest, yes? Teach a man to fish and he will be able to feed himself for life. Yeah, we all know that one. A book has recently come out by James Ferguson called Give a Man a Fish, Reflections on the New Politics of Distribution. And he says, you know what? Teach a man to fish and you create an unemployed fisherman. In our contemporary neo-colonial world, you teach a man to fish and he'll probably end up dead trying to cross the Mediterranean to get to Italy, like the Senegalese fisherman in the 2012 film La Pirogue, directed by Moussa Touré. In this neoliberal world, there aren't easy solutions. Teaching a man to fish, or even a woman to fish, is not going to help when we have an ecological crisis and global disparities of wealth. James Ferguson says, give a man a fish, and at least he can exchange it for something within a local commodity distribution economy. And actually, that's working. In Namibia, everyone has a basic income. In large parts of South Africa, lots of people are just given a basic income by the state. It keeps the local economy moving. It creates circulation of goods. Now, I'm sure you've heard of that idea as well. Universal benefits, basic citizens' income. We think it's a really good socialist idea that we're trying to push over here, some of us. In Africa, they've been doing it for ages. How many of us knew that? We don't look to Africa for expertise. Instead, we go to Africa to offer it. But Africans often know more than us because they've already been there. City planning, for example, and resource crises in over-expanding cities. Debbie Potts, who's recently retired as a geographer from KCL, has been arguing for years that the USA is reinventing wheels when it comes to city planning. She's produced paper after paper that shows that these questions have already been addressed and largely resolved. Well, not largely resolved, but at least beginning to be resolved by thinking going on in Africa. The thinking, at least, has already been done. But it's been done by Africans, and no one takes any notice of it. Philosophies of race and racism. Since Black Lives Matter, it's becoming increasingly of interest. We get features pieces in our newspapers, very often written by black journalists. How many people know about Mudimbe's work from 1988, or Hutonji's work from 1983? We expect to read women on feminism. Why don't we read Africans on colonialism and constructions of race? And what about our faith? What about theology? Do we perhaps not look to Africans when we think about spiritual issues? Because maybe just a little bit we mistrust African spiritualities. We're very comfortable with Buddhism, or at least a Buddhism that's presented to us in Europe. But particularly as unprogrammed Quakers, aren't we just a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps, with Kenyan evangelism? And aren't we uncomfortable even about talking about that discomfort? On that Facebook post yesterday, one comment suggested that Kenyan Quakers were, and this in itself, the phrasing is fascinating, they were not kosher. Now, you might expect there to be people piling in at that, but instead there was just one response that said, well, these all seem like God-fearing and God-loving people. So that's all right then. We're very good at being nice. When somebody says something that really needs a challenge, we just kind of sidestep it. But it's harder, in my experience, to know each other in the things that are eternal than it is to be nice. In my experience, African spirituality lives alongside ancestral spirits and other spirits in a very robust way. There's more room in African spirituality for miracles to happen. I was in Zimbabwe last month at Harare Meeting House, which is just, there's no warden there at the moment, but the Meeting House warden space is let out. And there was a change in tenants. And the tenant who was leaving claimed that the table and the curtains had actually been bought by him when he moved in, and that therefore they were his to take away. The clerk of meeting decided not to fight him. She said, "My friend, we're all suffering. You don't need to lie to me. If you want to take these things, tell me you want to take them." This isn't something she would have said a few years ago, but increasingly As her spirituality deepened, she felt more and more that there is that of God in everyone. And it was that of God that she was speaking to in this tenant as he left. That same afternoon, out of the blue, somebody phoned up and said, "I've got some curtains. Do you want them?" Now, we know this happens. We have these stories of our own. But in African spirituality, that happens all the time because there is just greater cultural openness to the work of spirits in everyone's life. There's room to think in African ways about spirituality, ways that we don't learn enough from. We're happy to go to Buddhism, but how often do we go to our own friends in Africa and say, teach us something spiritual? I was part of a post-meeting for worship discussion group in Harare meeting some years ago, and we were talking about how we want to build the kingdom of heaven on earth. God has no hands but ours. We are trying to make this world a better place. And what emerged from me from that discussion was something that stayed with me really powerfully. We don't want to build the kingdom of God. We want to build the kingdom. Mutual dependencies. I don't think a British Quaker would have come up with that. So why don't we share at this spiritual level? Why was our African Swarthmore lecture not about experiences of the Spirit? Well, my experience is that we've learned to distance ourselves to other. Sometimes to be just a little bit afraid of people from a different culture, from an African culture. And that is, of course, because the power structures in the world have molded us, and molded us in ways that we find hard to see. The FWCC minutes noted how we can be afraid of saying the wrong thing, of offending each other without meaning to, not understanding accents, upsetting protocols and cultural norms, and mostly, being British, we're afraid of causing embarrassment. So what do we want to unlearn? Who do we want to disempower? We can't be not white, so how do we want white to be? We feel discomfort. Friends, what would make us feel comfortable? Well, I think there's an easy answer to that. Equality. Equality would help, wouldn't it? Equality would help hugely. If we had equality of wealth, if we had equality of education, well, that would make us all much more comfortable, wouldn't it? Of course, there's a small matter of global social revolution in order to achieve that, but hey, we're Quakers. We're up for that. That's where we came in. We're trying to build the kingdom of heaven on earth. But equality of wealth, equality of education, wealth in what? Wealth in cash, wealth in cattle, wealth in people, wealth in kinship, and the dependencies that go with kinship. Maybe our idea of wealth isn't everyone's idea of wealth. Equality of education, yeah, that would be great. Education about what? Does the whole world want to be educated in the things that we're educated in? What language would people learn if we had equality of education? What would equal education be? Yes, we want equality. But whose equality? Are we not often simply reinscribing our Western hegemonies, our European legacies, and we don't even know we're doing it? On this journey that I've been on, I've found out that the more I learn, the more I don't know. We all know that happens. But I've also found the more we challenge power, the more power we see. It is not our fault that we think about Africa and aid and helping as we do. We live within structures of power that frame all of us. But when we try to think with the Spirit, we begin to see what we cannot see. The shape of the world becomes different. We realize things we did not know before. And this I know experimentally. I learned that I was rich when I was sitting outside meeting for worship in Harare again, and a friend was ranting about how angry she was at the politicians who are all so wealthy, and they have their cars, and they have their flat-screen televisions, and so on. And I said, well, wait a minute. I have those things. And said, yeah, but we don't mean you. But why not? Actually, we think about how we are middle class. We know that people in this country, many of them are very poor. But in global terms, if we take ourselves as a benchmark, we are misunderstanding what wealth is. We are all obscenely rich. So I try to think with the Spirit. I try to think with love. And thinking with love is both painful and terrifying. How can we bear to look this in the face? In Felix Holt, George Eliot says, "It is not true that love makes all things easy. It makes us choose what is difficult." Being nice and doing good is easy, but it doesn't get us out of existing power structures. Often, it reinforces them. Fortunately, often our African friends have already found ways that we can learn from. Most Quakers are Africans, and most Quakers do not worship in silence. But we like to think that we're good at silence. In our global conversation with Africa, perhaps we like to talk a little too much. We don't know what a genuine global equality will look like. But we won't even find out unless we stop trying to lead the path towards it. Our silence can and should be our ministry. When we bear our whiteness, bear means two things. It means we bring it into the space. It also means we endure it, because the burden of privilege is heavy. But we can also bear our whiteness as ministry. We can be the change. We can be silent. Let us think of Africans as donors, because actually they are. The flow of wealth flows into us. We just give a little bit of it back. The real donors in this world are the global poor. Let us think of Africans as donors, because they are spiritually rich, and we have much to learn from them. Let us think of Africans as donors, friends, because that is what love requires.
Thank you, friends, and thank you, Diana. There will be opportunities through these next few days to keep exploring these questions. I don't have the events listing in front of me, but if memory serves, there's a session on Sunday afternoon exploring privilege, and on Sunday morning with an opportunity to worship in the Kenyan style. Please do carry on upholding Diana and one another as we open this space to offer any reflections or any questions. And there are around the room, I believe, some people willing to carry roving microphones who are standing now. Perhaps if you would be willing to either raise your hand or stand, if you would like to offer a reflection or a question. I can see a hand here.
Thank you. I think that I can reflect back some of what you've said, Diana. I spent 14 years in East Africa and came home with a half-African son, and I know I learned far more there than ever I took to teach them, which was my job. But when my son was about 15 in this country, he was being teased in a nasty way by some people, in a racial way. And I said to him, "Oh, darling, I do understand." And he looked at me, red-eyed, and said, "Mum, you can't possibly."
I can see people. Yes, there's somebody standing at the back here, about 3 rows up on my left.
Thank you, Diana. Reflecting back on lessons that I've learned in my white experience, but as a woman, sometimes being silent doesn't amplify the voices not already being heard. Sometimes that just creates space for people already talking to speak louder. How do we, with our silence, amplify the voices that aren't already being heard?
Thank you. Is this working? Can people hear me? Okay. This is something I come up against a lot. There are power structures in the world, but as I can't remember who said it, it might have been Audre Lorde, we cannot bring down the walls of the master's house with the master's tools. We don't know what will happen if we keep quiet, because we rarely stay quiet long enough to find out. In my experience, if I uphold African women in the ways that they ask me to uphold them, which may be to ask me to speak, but in those cases, I want to ask them why and how we can try to overcome that. They know what they're talking about. Why do we need to speak for them? I understand that there are power structures that silence all of us. And yes, we are in solidarity with African women, but my career started by going to help African women. And what I learned was I help most by getting out of the way. I realize other people's experiences may be different.
I can see a hand, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows up next to the corridor. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. What you said about academics and institutions and power and having access to the stage and access to writing books and having microphones is really interesting to me, and a lot about silence. And I kind of wonder if you could have brought someone with you from Zimbabwe for this talk. It would have made a lot of sense in a way for me for this to be a discussion between you and someone else, because your perspective is interesting, but there's that empty space where I'm wondering what the other person is saying. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell us about, if you could have brought someone to be with you on stage today, who would you have brought, and a little bit about them, what they've said.
Would friends like me to answer that now? Thank you. In fact, I didn't thank everybody for their comments and questions. I'm sorry about that. Well, actually, as Graham will affirm, when I was first asked to do this, my first response was, no. Why am I being asked to speak? And it's because I think, because this is the one thing I can do as a white person. I can say, look, I can speak with authority about what it is to be white struggling with these things. And that's why I'm willing to talk about it. But of course, you're absolutely right. That's why I kept trying to bring in my friends and my experiences with Harare meeting. And we have a room full of people who have had wonderful experiences with our African friends. And yet somehow those aren't the main things we talk about. When we talk about what we're doing with our friends in Africa, we don't talk about our spiritual journeys with them. Or when we do, it's alongside talking about our donor relationships and so on. I just want us to talk, to start to learn. People who were at South Africa yearly meeting all came back saying, we had the most amazing worship sharing. We've never experienced worship sharing like that. Why are we not asking friends from Southern Africa yearly meeting to come and lead worship sharing for us? Why do we from Woodbrook go to teach them? Why do we not go there to learn from them? Why do we not invite them here to learn from us? The person I would love to have next to me right now, and there are people in this room who know her, and I'm so bad with names, I'll get to that age where I can't remember names, I can't remember her surname, but Benonia, who is the clerk of Harare monthly meeting. Benonia has been on an amazing journey. Benonia is the one who 5 years ago, when somebody had tried to take that table and curtains, she would have gone mad at them. She has worked through the suffering that so many people in Zimbabwe have had to cope with. She has changed her relationship with the material and the spiritual. And I have learned so much spiritually from Benonia. And that's why I would like her to be the person who's here, because she's a great spiritual teacher.
I can see a hand in the middle, about 4 rows back from the front.
Thank you. It's all very stimulating. I wanted to throw into this that we don't have to go to Africa to meet Africans. There are a lot of Africans in London. There's one particular family that I know very well, which are great friends of mine. I love them dearly, and they love me too. But the relationship is threaded through all the time by the fact that I'm wealthier than them. And so at times, not often, but they do ask me for money for things. And that, I just find, I don't know how to handle it better. It just all is very, very close to home to me. And I just wondered if you had any comments that might be helpful.
Regarding that you don't have to go to Africa, one of the many, many, many things that I cut out of this talk, I mean, I've been asked to talk about my whole life, you know, you have to cut out a lot, was the observation that, no, of course you don't have to go to Africa. We are where we are. This is what we know experimentally. The thing on Sunday, the privilege toolkit, we are all living here in this world now. We are all part of these global dispensations, and we can work on this right here, right now, even without knowing any African people. Although I would hope that we live but we live in Britain, and we know how, we know what Britain's like. So, regarding being asked for money, you know, I have a house and I have food, and I find it impossible to say no. And people say to me, you know, we must learn to say no. And I think, why? How dare we? We are so rich. We don't know how rich we are. As a result, I'm always getting into trouble because I always give all my money away. But there's a young woman that we are beginning to learn to trust each other, so that when she asks me for money, I trust her. She will tell me if she wants it for something frivolous, and why on earth shouldn't it be for something frivolous? I have money to spend on frivolous things. I was lucky. I was born into a middle-class family in one of the richest countries in the world. She wasn't lucky like that. But she was also beginning to trust me. So when I say, you know what, I actually can't spare it right now, she accepts that. And it's not an easy relationship. But it's a relationship that's growing in love as we learn to trust one another. And I suppose this is my point. Until we accept the power that we have and begin to ask, how can we disempower ourselves? Not how can we empower others? How can we disempower ourselves? Because it's not up to Africans to do that work. It's up to us to do that work. We have to do this work on ourselves, and we are only just beginning, and there's so much we can't see. That's why the Race and Privilege Toolkit is going to be so valuable. We don't know what an equal world looks like. We really don't, because we haven't yet really begun the conversation.
I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry, I'm ranting, I know.
I'd like to take it from our friend on the first row at the back, on the ground floor, so to speak.
Thank you. My name is Yvonne Stewart-Williams, and I'm from Brixton and Streatham Meeting. Thank you for your talk. I've listened carefully and stuff, and I think, from my perspective, the relationship is reciprocal and stuff. There's things that can be taught, and it's like a cell wall, and it's porous. You know, it transcends both sides. There are things that both parties, all of us, can bring to each other. But that's in general that I'm talking about. In particular, I'm talking about the way in which we, on this side, have sort of like worked out the sexuality theme and sort of like worked with that issue. And that is something I know from many African LGBTQ people who struggle in their, especially in their faith group, and when they do have relationships, they have this internalized homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and stuff. And that is something that we are in a position to sort of like give guidance on and support in and stuff. And as it's said in other areas, exchange is no robbery and stuff. It's two-way. It can't be a handout. It must be a hand up.
Thank you. I think what I've experienced is that everybody says it's an exchange, and that there's no... well, there are power relationships on both sides, but there's a willingness to take what is being offered by people that I've worked with in Africa. A joy in it. And there's a joy in the giving. And there is a learning that goes the other way, but it's often less recognized. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that I think very often we don't see how much we're not seeing. So fair exchange is no robbery, but I don't think we've got fair exchange. And I don't think we even yet really know what fair exchange will look like. And it's a journey. We're until we say, what are we not seeing, we're not even going to begin to start looking at what we don't see. So I think that because of where they're positioned in that power relationship, my friends in Africa have got a much clearer sense of the nature of that exchange. And I'm beginning to learn from them. Of course it's an exchange, but I don't think it's yet an equal exchange. And with the issue of sexuality, which, as I say, was actually where my doctorate went in that direction. Of course, we as Quakers in Britain have been magnificent in the way that we have struggled together to resolve our feelings, conflicted feelings, and I think no longer conflicted feelings. We were ahead of where British culture has got to, but I think British culture has changed a lot. In African culture, sexuality works in different ways, and I think actually one of the problems is that European ideas of sexuality have been imposed in different contexts and have created, I mean, I can get all Foucauldian about this, but that I think there are African approaches to sexuality that are much less homophobic. That when Africans say, as they often do, it was the missionaries who brought homosexuality, I think what came in with mission Christianity was a discourse of homosexuality that said this is sinful. I think there was, I think same-sex sex, of course, same-sex sex was always happening, but it wasn't spoken about in the same way. And one of the things that I try to do is not to say you shouldn't discriminate against same-sex, that's naughty, that's bad, we've got the idea about what human rights are and we've got it right and you've got it wrong. But to try to work with historians to uncover deeper histories of African sexualities, to find another story which isn't the West saying, we know the right ways to do human rights and you don't, but to say there are deeper histories here that African historians can reclaim for themselves, where we think about sexuality differently, and we don't need the West to tell us about those.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Diana, for bringing your whole self to this lecture. I'm now going to hand back to the clerk for some notices.
It all feels rather humdrum in the light of the lecture we've had. But just to let you know that QSS will have a stall at the group fair on Sunday evening. So if you have any questions for us or you would like to join QSS, we will be there to respond to your questions and thoughts. The definitive biography of Ada Salter is by our friend Graham Taylor, who is with us today. And here is the book. And I believe Graham is willing to sign copies of the book, and it will be available after this event and on the stall, and there'll be copies in the bookshop. So it is a most wonderful read, inspiring in its own way. Just to say that we have been doing a bit of an audit of our contact list and our paid-up membership, and we found a bit of a discrepancy. So if, friends, you have been receiving things from QSS, perhaps you'd just like to give a thought as to whether you've been able to contribute your subscriptions over the last year or two. And Alison, who is here also, both membership secretary and treasurer, will be glad to receive any contributions that you're able to make. Our AGM, our QSS AGM, will take place on the 9th of June, 9th of next month, at 2 o'clock at the Westminster Meeting House. As well as our routine matters, I'm hoping that we will begin a discussion about QSS structures, particularly on this, for us, a rather vexed question about how we take QSS across the country and all QSS members and friends can feel part of the organisation. So I'm hoping, as clerk, that we will start that debate then. But after the AGM, we are going to have a planning meeting, hopefully. An event is taking place in July. Our nation is receiving a visit from the President of the United States, as you may have noticed. I think he arrives on the 13th of July. And on the 14th of July, there is to be a mass gathering, do we call it a demonstration? I don't know, in London to hopefully convey the strong message that what the current President of the United States represents, his values are not the same as our values, committed as we are to peace and equality on the issues that we know so well. We are very keen to have a QSS presence there, and no doubt there will be other Quakers independently or as part of other sections of the Quaker community to be there. It is so important that as many people attend this event in London on the 14th of July. I've been introduced to the phrase non-violent photobombing. I'm not sure whether that's a Quaker phrase or not, but what I think it means, and Tim will correct me, what I think it means is that we need a huge turnout just to make clear, hopefully, the views, well, certainly our views of Quakers, but of our country as a whole, about the sort of things that seem to be represented and symbolised by the current President of the United States. And if pictures of that, these aerial photographs, can be beamed back to America, and Americans can see that actually these values are not shared across the globe, and perhaps as a reinforcement to those who feel hurt in America, in the United States, hurt by the actions of the present president, then it will have been a worthwhile event. But that can only happen if people go to it, and perhaps somewhere in Cleveland, Ohio, they will see the Quaker Socialist banner there amongst the crowd. So I hope that as many people as possible will go there, go on the 14th of July. So what we will be doing, hopefully, following our AGM, is to examining further how we can make our own arrangements for the day. So our AGM is on the 9th of June from 2 till 4:30, and you're welcome to join us there at the Westminster Meeting House. Thank you. Shall we just have a little silence now?